I'm wondering, when did he start having any questioning towards his father's prejudices? Most people who grow up in that kind of an environment just subconsciously adopt the prejudices. They don't even think about it.
Not Gene. Gene was always a very self-assured little boy. He was his own person even very early on. His classmates in junior and senior high school would describe him to me as kind of separate and apart and always observing what was going on. Gene would always question authority and would run whatever was told to him by an authority figure through either his own intelligence filter or through his own web of experience. And if it didn't jibe with what he had been told or what he knew by his own intelligence or his own series of experiences, he basically would either put it aside and reconsider it later or would ignore it.
Well, tell me about when Gene became, and I'm going to say this even though it kind of contradicts what you said here, but when did Gene start to become his own person? Obviously, he was his own person while he was still living under his father's house, but I'm wondering if you could probably tell us about when Gene left home to basically establish his own identity. What was that like? What kind of circumstances did he find himself in?
Well, he essentially marked that at about 16 or so, when he was coming into his own as a personality, and when he essentially rejected his mother's religion. His mother was a good Baptist right out of the South from El Paso, and it was about 16 or so when, as he told me, he actually started listening to the sermons that were being preached and thought that it was crazy, magical superstition and nonsense. And that was at about the time he stopped going to church. He left home at about the age of 19 or 20 to go off to the war. He had joined the Army Air Force in July of 1941, and then when the Japanese visited Pearl Harbor on December 7th, he got his call 11 days later, and he was off to Kelly Field in Texas for advanced pilot training. He already was a pilot. He had gotten his wings when he was a student at Los Angeles City College, in the civilian pilot training program there.
So, when he was in the Air Force, I have to ask this, when he was on the Air Force, did he spend any time on the USS Enterprise?
The Enterprise was the flagship of, I think it was Admiral Halsey at the time, and it did come into the bay where Gene was stationed in Fiji. And whether he actually got on the ship or not, I do not know. He did later in life spend time on one of the aircraft carriers, I believe. I think it was either the Kennedy or the Enterprise, one of the nuclear aircraft carriers. I don't remember precisely which one, but he spent a week on that well after Star Trek and fame.
So, okay, we have a man who's coming out where his father is a LAPD patrolman, and then he goes into the military. Where did this interest in television come from?
Well, Gene wanted to be a writer. He had wanted to be a writer since his teenage days, but making a living as a writer, actually he wanted to be a poet, but making a living as a poet was a very haphazard arrangement. He had been married, he had a child, and this is about 1948, 1949, 48 actually. And he saw a television set at a neighbor's back in New York when he was living in New York flying for Pan American. And he thought that that was going to be the wave of the future. A little movie screen, entertainment in everyone's home. He thought that that would be the wave of the future, and ultimately quit Pan Am and moved to California, where he thought, since the movie production was situated out here, that's where television production would be. Unfortunately, he was wrong. Mostly television production at that time was in New York. And so he stayed out here and got a job as, ironically enough, a policeman.
But I'm trying to get to that gap from being a policeman into going into the TV industry. I mean, this was not at the time when you could just go to, say, USC and just have a nice full-blown film program like you have today.
No, that's true. One of the things that I did in the book was to detail how Gene taught himself to write. As you say, there were no extension classes, there were no books, there were books on how to write plays. I think the Art of Dramatic Writing by Egris existed, and a few others, but there was nothing on how to write for television. What you have in the early days of television in the 1950s is a situation that is perfectly analogous to the pulp magazine days of the 20s and 30s. A lot of terrific writers learned to write for the pulps. Ray Bradbury, Asimov, Earl Stanley Gardner, perhaps the greatest example that most of your audience would recognize today. They would write and write and write thousands and thousands of words. Their editors would tell them what they would want, and essentially through feedback, they would learn what the editors would want and what the public would accept. Well, in early television just had hundreds of half-hour anthology programs doing what were essentially short stories on television. And this became a very definite form that you had to write within a certain format. You had to write for 2 characters or 4 characters or whatever it was. You had to write fairly quickly if you were going to make a living at it. And then you had to write reasonably well. Gene learned how to do that. He learned how to write quickly, he learned how to write well, and developed his skills. He was working for the Public Information Division of the Los Angeles Police Department when Fred Ziv, Z-I-V, the early television pioneer, radio pioneer, and then he became a television pioneer, called and asked for a technical advisor for his program, Mr. District Attorney. Captain Stanley Sheldon, who was Gene's boss, sent Gene over. I found Fred Ziv. He's 89 years old now, I think it is, and great raconteur. Told me this terrific story about this large policeman. Gene was almost 6'3", at the Ziv studios for several days, uniform, badge, gun, whistle, everything, reading over scripts, and then saying to their story editor, John Epstein, well, I can write stuff as good as this. And at that point he was invited. Well, if you're so good, why don't you show us something? He did. They liked it, they bought it. In fact, I reproduced the original story outline, the original pitch letter that Gene sent them. It sold, and he got $700 for something that took about a week or so to write. And at that time, Gene was making just over $400 as a policeman for a month's pay. So this was exciting. This was a lot of money. And so he kept working and kept working to the point where he became quite good at it and ultimately had to quit the LAPD.